December 6, 1240. The Church of the Tithes in Kiev. The fires had been extinguished for 3 days. Mongol commander Subotai walked through the rubble of what was once the holiest site in Ruzes, listening. His men had declared the great city empty, its population fled or dead. But Subotai knew better. He had brought specialists from the eastern steppes, 27 Asiatic mastiffs, bred for centuries to track humans across impossible distances. The lead dog, a massive beast the Mongols called Kaku, Blue, stopped at a pile of collapsed masonry that had once been the church's southern wall. The animal didn't bark. Instead, it sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on the rubble, breath steaming in the winter air. "Dig," Subotai ordered. What the Mongol soldiers pulled from that sacred ground in the next hour would be recorded by chroniclers as far away as Vienna and Paris. Over 300 people had been hiding in a cavity beneath the church floor. Men, women, children, clergy. They had survived the 12-day siege in absolute silence, breathing through cracks in the stone, listening to their city die above them. But the truth was far more terrifying than survival. Before we uncover the truth about the siege of Kiev and the Mongol dogs that detected hidden citizens in the ruins of 1240, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. This is a story that's been buried in fragmented chronicles and contradictory accounts for nearly 800 years. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. Now, let's descend into one of medieval history's most chilling episodes. The year 1240 sits at a pivot point in human history. While Western Europe celebrated the construction of grand cathedrals and debated theological fine points, an empire unlike any before it swept westward from the steppes of Mongolia. This wasn't merely a conquest. This was the systematic erasure of civilizations. Kiev in 1240 was not the city you might visit today. It was the mother of all Rus' cities, the Jerusalem of the East, a jewel of Orthodox Christianity with over 50,000 inhabitants. The city sprawled across the hills above the Dnieper River, protected by massive earthen ramparts and wooden palisades. 400 churches punctuated its skyline, their golden domes visible for miles across the plains. Prince Mikhail Vsevolodovich had fled months earlier, leaving Kiev under the command of Prince Dmitry, a capable warrior but a man facing an impossible situation. By November 1240, the Mongol horde under Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan himself, had surrounded the city with an estimated 30,000 mounted warriors. But this chronicle isn't about the siege itself. That story has been told. The battering rams, the siege towers, the systematic destruction of Kiev's defenses. What has been obscured, deliberately perhaps, is what came after. What happened during those strange, silent days after the city fell, when Mongol commanders employed methods so disturbing that Christian chroniclers struggled to describe them without theological context. The Mongols brought something to Kiev that no Rus' defender had anticipated: war dogs. Not the hunting dogs or guard dogs familiar to medieval Europeans, but specialized tracking animals developed over generations on the Eurasian steppes. These were Asiatic mastiffs, descendants of Tibetan breeds, massive animals weighing up to 200 pounds, with extraordinary olfactory capabilities. Contemporary sources describe them as blue beasts, likely referring to a gray-blue coat coloration. The Mongol term was gamper, guardian, but guardian implies protection. These animals were weapons. Prince Dmitry himself had written to his brother 3 weeks before the final assault. They have brought beasts with them, great hounds that they keep separate far. The camp. The men fear these dogs more than they fear the arrows. We know Dmitry survived the initial siege, though his fate afterward remains disputed. His letter, preserved in a monastery chronicle from Novgorod, provides our first direct reference to the mastiffs. What made these dogs particularly terrifying was their training. Mongol military tactics were sophisticated far beyond what medieval Europeans understood. While Western armies still relied primarily on heavy cavalry and infantry formations, the Mongols had developed combined arms warfare involving cavalry, siege engines, intelligence networks, and psychological operations. The dogs were part of the psychological warfare apparatus. They weren't trained to attack, they were trained to find. Consider the context. When the Mongols besieged a city, they offered terms. Surrender immediately, and the population might be spared, reduced to vassalage but alive. Resist, and the laws of Mongol warfare dictated complete destruction. Kiev had resisted. For 12 days, the defenders had held, using every defensive tactic available to medieval warfare. On December 6th, The eastern wall fell. Mongol cavalry poured through the breach. By nightfall, organized resistance had collapsed. The city burned. Traditional histories tell us that survivors fled to the Church of the Tithes, where the overcrowded galleries collapsed, killing hundreds. This is where the official narrative becomes incomplete. Mongol record-keeping was meticulous. They counted everything: arrows expended, horses lost, enemy dead. A Mongolian chronicle fragment, discovered in 1924 in a Beijing archive, records that after Kiev's fall, Batu Khan ordered a census of survivors. The count seemed impossibly low. A city of 50,000 yielded fewer than 2,000 captives. "Where are the others?" Batu Khan reportedly asked his commanders. The steppes had taught the Mongols that people don't simply vanish. In previous sieges, Samarkand, Nishapur, Merv, survivors had hidden in wells, cellars, sewers, crypts. The Mongols had learned to find them. This is when Subotai, one of history's greatest military strategists, gave an order that would be whispered about in Rus's territories for generations: "Release the blue ones." December 7, 1240. First light. A Venetian merchant named Marco Barberini had been trapped in Kiev during the siege, sheltering in a fortified warehouse near the river. His account, written after he escaped to Galicia, provides the first witness testimony of what happened next. In the morning, the smoke cleared enough to see. The Tatars had divided the city into sections as if it were a great hunt. They moved through each quarter with their gray beasts, which they kept on long chains of iron. Barberini describes the dogs as working in pairs, systematically covering ground. They did not bark or growl. They moved with purpose, stopping at rubble, at cellars, at wells. When they stopped, the Tatar soldiers would immediately begin excavating. The first discoveries were predictable: survivors hiding in obvious places, a family of craftsmen in a cellar beneath a collapsed workshop, an elderly priest in a church confessional. Mongol policy was consistent. Survivors were sorted. Skilled artisans, young women and children were taken as captives. Soldiers and nobles were executed. The elderly and infirm were killed on the spot. But Barberini notes something that clearly disturbed him. "The beasts found people in places where I would not have thought to look. A young girl buried beneath 3 feet of ash and timber, in a space no larger than a coffin. How she breathed, I cannot say. The beast stood over the spot for no more than a minute before the Tatars understood and began to dig. The girl was 8 years old. When pulled from the debris, she was unconscious but alive. She survived, was taken as a captive, and appears in later records as a servant in a Mongol household in Sarai. Her name was Urina. We know this because she was eventually ransomed and returned to Rus territories in 1247, where she gave testimony to Orthodox clergy. Urina's account is fragmentary. She was a child and traumatized. But she remembered the dog. It was the color of storm clouds. Its eyes were yellow. It did not bark. It simply knew where we were. The second incident occurred at the Monastery of the Caves, Kiev's most sacred site, built into the hillsides above the river. The monastery had extensive catacombs, burial chambers and meditation cells carved into the soft sandstone. When the Mongols arrived on December 8th, they found the monastery buildings destroyed but the catacomb entrances deliberately collapsed. A Mongol military report, translated from Persian in the 19th century, describes the operation. The General Subotai brought 4 of the tracking beasts to the sacred caves of the Christians. The beasts indicated 7 separate locations where the caves had been sealed from within. Earth-moving crews opened each location. In total, 143 persons were extracted, many already dead from suffocation. The monk who sealed the last entrance had done so from inside, entombing himself with the others. His body was found pressed against the rockfall, fingers bloodied from attempting to claw back through. The psychological horror of this decision, choosing certain death by suffocation over potential death by Mongol swords, speaks to the terror that had gripped Kiev's population. But the third incident is where the historical record becomes truly disturbing. December 9th, 1240. The Church of the Tithes. This was Kiev's oldest stone church, commissioned by Prince Vladimir in 989 after the Christianization of Russes. It had already been severely damaged. The chronicles mention that the galleries had collapsed under the weight of refugees, killing hundreds. Mongol soldiers had been using the ruins as a camp, sleeping among the rubble and corpses. It was a Mongol officer named Jelmi, according to Persian sources, who noticed something wrong. The bodies in the church ruins were days old. In the December cold, decomposition was slow, but there should have been a certain smell, a certain progression of decay. Instead, the church ruins smelled like people. Living people. Jelme brought this observation to Subotai, who ordered the dogs brought in. The lead dog, Koku, entered the church ruins and immediately displayed what handlers call alert behavior. The animal stopped moving, lowered its head, and fixed its attention on a section of collapsed floor near what had been the altar. "Dig," Subotai ordered. What emerged over the next 3 hours defied the Mongol soldiers' understanding of human endurance. Beneath the collapsed floor was a cavity, part natural limestone formation, part deliberately excavated chamber. It was approximately 40 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 7 feet high at its tallest point. Inside were 317 people. They had been there for 9 days. A Russian chronicle from Novgorod, compiled from survivor testimonies, describes the scene. When the stones were lifted, the Christians emerged as if from the tomb itself, pale as death, unable to stand, their eyes unable to bear the light. Many had gone mad in the darkness. Children had died in silence, their bodies held by mothers who would not release them. The chamber had no sanitation, no light. Limited air flowed through cracks in the stone. The people inside had survived on what they carried: bread, dried fish, wine that had long since run out. They had disciplined themselves to absolute silence. No crying, no praying aloud, no speaking except in whispers so quiet they could barely be heard. They had listened to their city die above them. They had heard the Mongol horses, the Mongol voices, the Mongol camps established directly over their hiding place. And they had remained silent, breathing. Shallow breaths, waiting for rescue or death. A survivor named Father Ilarion later testified, "We could hear them above us, walking on the stones that covered us. We could smell their fires. On the 7th day, a child began to cry, and her mother covered her mouth until the crying stopped. The child did not survive. We kept her body with us. We had nowhere else to put her." The psychological discipline required for this survival is almost incomprehensible. 300 people, including dozens of children, maintaining near absolute silence for 9 days in total darkness. But they had failed to account for one factor: the Mongols' dogs. The fourth incident, and this is where historical sources become contradictory and disturbing, occurred on December 10th at various locations throughout the city. Emboldened by the success at the Church of the Tithes, Subotai ordered a systematic sweep of the entire city using all 27 dogs. The operation took 3 days. By December 13th, the Mongol records indicate they had discovered an additional 463 survivors in hiding places throughout Kiev. Some of these locations defy rational explanation. A nobleman named Vsevolod was found buried beneath a collapsed stable, in a space so small he had been unable to move for 6 days. A merchant family of 7 had created a false wall in their cellar, living in a space 16 inches deep. They had dismantled themselves into the narrowest possible configuration of human bodies, remaining absolutely motionless whenever they heard footsteps. But the most disturbing discovery came from the Podil district, Kiev's merchant quarter. The dogs led Mongol soldiers to a well that had been deliberately collapsed. When excavated, the well revealed a cavity at the bottom, an old cistern, long since dry. Inside were 43 people. They had been lowering themselves into the well using a rope. The last person down had cut the rope and collapsed the well entrance from below, sealing themselves in. They had survived for 10 days in a chamber with no light, no fresh air, and no escape route. When pulled out, 17 were already dead. The survivors were catatonic, unable or unwilling to speak. One woman, eventually identified as the wife of a merchant named Boris, never recovered her ability to speak. She was taken as a captive to the Mongol capital at Karakorum, where she appeared in later records as a servant in a nobleman's household. She lived until approximately 1255, never speaking a single word, according to travelers' accounts. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. It helps us bring more forgotten history to light. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries and historical horror. The next part of this story gets even more disturbing, as we discover what the Mongols did with this information and how it changed siege warfare forever. Let's discover what happens next. By December 15, 1240, the operation had yielded over 800 additional survivors, people who had been written off as dead or fled. This discovery had profound implications that rippled far beyond Kiev's ruins. Subotai was not merely a general, he was a military innovator. He recognized immediately what these dogs represented: a revolution in siege warfare. For centuries, defenders had relied on a simple calculation. If you could hide enough people well enough, the attackers would eventually leave. Sieges ended when food ran out, or disease struck, or political circumstances changed. The dogs changed that equation fundamentally. A fragment from a Mongol military manual, discovered in a Chinese archive in 1967, contains what appears to be Subbotai's analysis. The Christians believe that stone and darkness can hide them from heaven's judgment. We have shown that nothing is hidden from the Khan's hounds. This knowledge will precede us to every city Estward. Resistance becomes meaningless when surrender in the open field becomes preferable to discovery in the dark. This is psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. The Mongols weren't just finding hidden survivors in Kiev. They were creating a reputation, a myth that would spread faster than their armies. And spread it did. Father Ilarion, the priest who survived the chamber beneath the Church of the Tithes, was eventually released as part of a prisoner exchange in 1242. He made his way to Novgorod, where he gave testimony to church authorities. His account was copied and distributed to monasteries throughout Orthodox territories. But Ilarion's testimony contains details that suggest something even more disturbing than efficient military tactics. He describes the behavior of the Mongol soldiers when they discovered the hiding survivors. They showed no surprise, no anger at having been deceived. They worked with the precision of men who had done this many times before. The beasts received rewards, meat from their handlers. The Christians were sorted as if they were wheat after threshing. This clinical efficiency suggests systematic practice. The dogs weren't a novel experiment in Kiev. They had been used before, refined, improved. Kiev was simply the first time Christian chroniclers had witnessed the technique. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Excavations in Samarkand, which fell to the Mongols in 1220, revealed hidden chambers beneath several buildings that showed evidence of forced excavation. Skeletal remains found in these chambers showed signs of discovery and execution. Similar findings have emerged from sites in Nishapur, Merv, and Balkh, all cities that fell to Mongol sieges before Kiev. The Mongols had been perfecting this technique for 20 years. Kiev simply provided the largest-scale demonstration in a Christian context, ensuring the story would spread throughout Europe. But there's another layer to this discovery that historical sources have struggled to address directly. What happened to the survivors? Mongol policy regarding conquered populations was pragmatic to the point of ruthlessness. Useful people, artisans, scholars, beautiful women, strong children, were taken as slaves and distributed throughout the empire. Phoenician traveler John of Plano Carpini, who visited the Mongol capital in 1246, noted seeing many Russians and Christians from the lands of Rus in service to the Tatars, speaking their languages and wearing their clothes. Some of these were almost certainly survivors from Kiev's hidden chambers. Genetic studies of modern Central Asian populations show spikes in Eastern European DNA markers dating to the 13th century, particularly in regions around the old Mongol capitals. These are the descendants of people who survived sieges like Kiev. But surviving discovery by the dogs didn't guarantee survival overall. The psychological trauma alone was devastating. Multiple chronicle sources describe survivors who never spoke again, who refused to enter enclosed spaces, who could not tolerate darkness or silence. A Rus's chronicle from 1245 mentions a woman from Kiev who had been ransomed and returned home. She would not enter the church, even to pray. She would not sleep in a house. She spent her nights in the open air, even in winter, saying that she could not bear walls around her. She died before the year was done. This is what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The survivors of Kiev's hidden chambers had endured psychological torture that shattered their ability to function in normal society. And perhaps most disturbingly, the Mongols understood this. They weren't just using the dogs to find people. They were using the dogs to break people, to create such terror that future cities would surrender rather than risk similar discovery. It worked. When Batu Khan's armies approached Hungary in 1241, emissaries from several Hungarian cities offered immediate surrender upon hearing descriptions of what had happened in Kiev. The dogs had become legendary, exaggerated in the telling, transformed into mythical beasts with supernatural powers. A Hungarian chronicle from 1241 describes them as hounds from hell, which can smell fear itself, which can find a man's soul even if he hides his body. This is mythology, but mythology born from very real terror. The physical evidence from Kiev itself tells the final chapter of this discovery. When archaeologists excavated the site of the Church of the Tithes in the 1820s and again in the 1970s, they found the chamber. It was exactly as described in the chronicles, a limestone cavity beneath the church floor, entrance sealed with rubble. But they found something else, scratch marks on the stone walls. Hundreds of them. Fingernail scratches, worn into the limestone by people trying to mark time, trying to leave messages, trying to maintain sanity in the absolute darkness. One message, scratched in Old Church Slavonic, was still legible: "Forgive us, Lord, for we choose life even in this tomb." The aftermath of Kiev's fall and the deployment of the Mongol mastiffs created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate military campaign. What happened in Kiev became a case study in psychological warfare that military strategists would analyze for centuries. Batu Khan's invasion of Rusas continued westward after Kiev, but something had changed. The reputation of the dogs preceded the Mongol armies. When advance scouts appeared before the walls of Vladimir Volhynsky in January 1241, the city surrendered without siege. The same occurred at Chernihiv, at Halych, at Volodymyr. Contemporary chronicles note the reasoning. Defenders calculated that hiding was no longer viable. If the Mongols could find 300 people in a sealed chamber beneath solid stone, no hiding place was safe. The only options were to fight in the open field, suicidal against Mongol cavalry, or to surrender and hope for terms. This is the strategic brilliance of Subbotai's deployment of the dogs. It wasn't about the 800 people they found in Kiev. It was about the tens of thousands who surrendered in subsequent cities because they believed resistance was futile. But what happened to the dogs themselves, and to the knowledge they represented? Historical sources suggest the Mongols carefully controlled this technology. The mastiffs were valuable military assets, treated with the same care as siege engines or specialized cavalry units. Breeding programs were maintained in Mongolia proper, with puppies distributed to specific military units only. A Persian source from 1255 discussing Mongol military organization under Möngke Khan mentions the keepers of the blue hounds, who were ranked as officers and given special provisions. These handlers were specialists, likely trained from childhood, in the management and deployment of the dogs. The European response to the Mongol invasion, and specifically to the reports about the dogs, reveals the psychological impact. Multiple sources from the 1240s and 1250s discuss the Mongol hounds, in tones usually reserved for demonic forces. Pope Innocent IV, in a letter to European monarchs in 1245, wrote, "These servants of Satan employ beasts that hunt Christians as wolves hunt sheep. No sanctuary is sacred to them, no hiding place is beyond their reach." The Pope was using the dogs as propaganda to encourage resistance, but his language shows how deeply the Kiev incident had penetrated European consciousness. Interestingly, several European military thinkers attempted to develop counter-strategies. A military treatise from France, dated to approximately 1250, proposes various methods to evade or confuse tracking dogs, using strong-smelling substances, moving through water, creating false trails. These are tactics that modern understanding of canine olfactory capabilities confirms. Wow. LD have limited effectiveness, but their inclusion in military literature shows that European commanders took the threat seriously. The survivors themselves, those who were eventually ransomed, escaped, or released, became living testimony to the Mongol methods. Several ended up in monasteries, where they gave detailed accounts to chroniclers. One such survivor was a nobleman named Yuri, who had hidden with his family in a cellar beneath his destroyed home. His account, preserved in a monastery chronicle from Novgorod, describes the moment of discovery. "We heard the beast above us, walking across the rubble. It made no sound except for breathing. Then it stopped, simply stopped, directly above where we hid. Within minutes we heard the Tatars digging. We knew we were discovered. My wife began to pray. I told her to stop, that perhaps they would miss us, but the beast knew. It knew exactly where we were." Yuri's family was separated. He and his sons were executed. His wife and daughter were taken as slaves. Yuri himself survived only because he possessed skills in metalworking that the Mongols valued. He spent 3 years in captivity before managing to escape during a period of political instability following the death of Ogedei Khan. His testimony is important because it confirms the precision of the dog's capabilities. This wasn't vague tracking or fortunate guessing. The dogs could pinpoint human location with frightening accuracy. Legal and political responses to the Mongol invasion varied across the fragmented Rus's principalities. Some princes negotiated submission and vassalage, accepting Mongol overlordship in exchange for maintaining local authority. Others continued resistance, with predictably disastrous results. But an interesting development occurred in the 1250s and 1260s. Several Rus's princes attempted to acquire similar tracking dogs. Trade missions were sent to Central Asia, specifically requesting hunting and tracking breeds. Some succeeded. A chronicle from the Principality of Tver mentions that Prince Yaroslav Yaroslavich kept great hounds from the eastern lands. and used them for hunting and euphemistically seeking fugitives. Whether these were actual Mongol mastiffs or similar breeds is unclear, but the desire to possess the technology that had defeated them is telling. The Orthodox Church responded to the Kiev massacre and the use of the dogs with theological interpretation. Several sermons from the 1240s describe the Mongol invasion as divine punishment for the sins of Russes. The dogs in this framework were instruments of God's judgment, able to find the guilty no matter where they hid. This theological interpretation had lasting impact. For generations, the blue hounds appeared in Orthodox religious art and literature as symbols of inescapable divine justice. Icons from the 14th and 15th centuries sometimes depict the Last Judgment with dog-like creatures hunting sinners. The psychological trauma to Kiev itself was profound and lasting. When the city was eventually rebuilt in the late 13th and 14th centuries, the Church of the Tithes was not reconstructed on its original location. The site was considered cursed. Local tradition held that the spirits of those who died in the hidden chamber still haunted the ruins. Archaeological excavations in the 1970s found evidence supporting this folk memory. The chamber beneath the church had never been properly cleared. Skeletal remains, particularly of children, were still present, along with personal items, prayer beads, icons, pieces of cloth that had once been clothing. Perhaps most disturbing, excavators found a small wooden toy, a carved horse, clutched in the hand of a child's skeleton. This single artifact brought the historical horror into sharp personal focus. These weren't abstract victims, they were specific people, parents trying to save children, children trying to be brave, families making impossible choices in absolute darkness. The broader, military implications of the Mongol dog tactics extended well beyond the 13th century. When European powers began their own colonial expansions, they studied Mongol military techniques, including the use of animals in warfare and siege operations. Spanish conquistadors in the Americas employed war dogs against indigenous populations, a direct descendant of Mongol tactics. British colonial forces in India and Africa similarly used tracking dogs to hunt insurgents and escapees. The fundamental strategy, using animals' superior sensory capabilities to overcome human hiding, proved consistently effective across centuries and continents. But the specific breeds and training techniques the Mongols used seem to have been lost or diluted over time. Modern attempts to identify the historical blue hounds have produced various theories: Tibetan mastiffs, Central Asian shepherd dogs, or extinct breeds unique to the Mongol military. Without genetic samples, which are unlikely to exist, definitive identification is impossible. What we do know is that the Mongol Empire's collapse in the 14th century ended the systematic breeding and deployment of these specialized military dogs. By the time Marco Polo traveled through Mongol territories in the 1270s and 1280s, he makes no mention of military tracking dogs, suggesting the practice had already declined. The final aftermath concerns memory and historical consciousness. For the people of Rus, the Mongol invasion became a defining trauma, a before and after moment in cultural identity. The use of dogs to hunt Christians in sacred spaces became a particular focus of horror in popular memory. Folk songs from Ukraine and Russia, some collected as late as the 19th century, reference gray hounds that hunt souls and smell fear. These songs preserve cultural memory of events from the 13th century, passed down through generations. And perhaps most tellingly, when Kiev was occupied by Nazi forces in 1941, some elderly residents reportedly refused to hide in underground shelters, citing historical memory of what happened to people who hid from invaders. "The dogs will find us," one elderly woman reportedly told a Soviet officer, referencing events 700 years in the past. Trauma, it seems, has a very long memory. The siege of Kiev and the deployment of Mongol tracking dogs represents a pivotal moment in military history, but its implications extend far beyond medieval warfare. What happened in Kiev in December 1240 changed fundamental assumptions about security, sanctuary, and the possibility of escape. Before the Mongol invasions, siege warfare operated on certain understood principles. Cities could hold out if they had supplies and strong walls. Populations could hide, disperse, flee. The surrounding countryside offered places of refuge: forest, caves, ruins. The balance between attacker and defender was uncertain enough that resistance seemed rational. The dogs changed this calculation by eliminating the hiding option. This had cascading effects on medieval military strategy and civilian behavior during wartime. Consider the evolution of fortification design in the decades following the Mongol invasions. European castles and fortified cities increasingly incorporated what military historians call secure refuges, deliberately designed spaces where populations could shelter during sieges. But these were above ground, well ventilated, and designed for prolonged habitation. The old medieval practice of hiding in crypts, cellars, and underground chambers largely disappeared after 1240. Knowledge of what happened in Kiev had taught a brutal lesson. Underground hiding was a death trap. Better to design fortifications that could actually withstand siege than to rely on concealment. This represents a fundamental shift in defensive philosophy directly traceable to Mongol innovations, including the dogs. The psychological implications were equally profound. The belief that one could escape notice through stillness and silence, a primal human instinct when facing predators, was systematically proven false. The dogs taught that human scent was inescapable, that breathing itself was a betrayal, that the very body would testify against its owner. This created a specific kind of existential horror that pervades testimonies from survivors. It wasn't just fear of death. Soldiers faced that in open battle. It was the fear of being hunted while helpless, of being found despite all precautions, of having one's most clever survival strategy turned into a tomb. Religious and philosophical implications emerged as well. Orthodox Christianity, dominant in Ruses, had strong traditions around sanctuary and sacred space. Churches were supposed to be inviolable refuges. The Mongol violation of these spaces, aided by the dogs, created theological crises. How could God allow sacred ground to be so profaned? How could animals, creatures without souls, be used to drag Christians from churches? Multiple theological treatises from the 13th and 14th centuries grapple with these questions, generally concluding that the Mongol invasion was divine punishment, but the unease is palpable in the texts. In broader terms, the Mongol use of dogs at Kiev demonstrated the power of psychological warfare when combined with real capability. The reputation of the dogs grew far beyond their actual deployment. By 1245, European sources were claiming the Mongols had thousands of demon hounds that could track a man across continents. This was nonsense, but it didn't matter. The myth did as much damage as the reality. Modern military doctrine recognizes this principle. Specialized capabilities, deployed visibly enough to create reputation, can influence enemy behavior far beyond their actual scope. The Mongol dogs were used in perhaps a dozen major sieges, but the fear they created influenced hundreds of strategic decisions. The social implications within Rus's territories persisted for generations. Trust in hiding as a survival strategy was fundamentally broken. When subsequent threats emerged, invasions by Lithuanians, Teutonic Knights, later by Crimean Tatars, Rus's populations were far more likely to attempt organized defense or evacuation rather than concealment. This had demographic effects. Cities that might have maintained larger populations through periods of danger instead saw mass evacuations. The Rus's population became more mobile, more dispersed, harder to capture en masse, but also harder to organize for coordinated defense. Ironically, this created the conditions for the eventual rise of Moscow. The fragmented, mobile Rus's populations eventually coalesced around strong central authority that could provide actual protection, rather than just hiding places. The Mongol invasions, and specifically the terror they created, helped shape the centralized Russian state. From a humanitarian perspective, what happened at Kiev demonstrates the particular cruelty of tactics that eliminate civilian agency. The people in those hiding places had made rational survival choices based on historical precedent. They had protected their families the best way they knew. The dogs made those choices not just futile but actively counterproductive. Survival strategies became death traps. This pattern recurs throughout human conflict. Technological or tactical innovations that eliminate previously effective civilian survival strategies create specific types of trauma and helplessness. The Mongol dogs in 1240, like aerial bombardment in the 20th century, taught populations that there was nowhere to hide, fundamentally altering the psychological landscape of warfare. The environmental and ecological implications, though less discussed, are also notable. The Mongol Empire was history's largest contiguous land empire, and it achieved this partly through careful management of animal resources, including horses and dogs. The breeding programs that UCD, the tracking mastiffs required sophisticated understanding of genetics, nutrition, and training. This knowledge was largely lost when the Mongol Empire collapsed. Modern attempts to recreate similar capabilities, military and police tracking dogs, had to rediscover principles the Mongols had mastered in the 13th century. We may actually have regressed in some areas of working dog development. Finally, the ethical implications remain uncomfortably relevant. The use of animals to hunt humans raises questions about the boundaries of legitimate warfare. International humanitarian law now restricts certain weapons and tactics based on the suffering they cause. Would the Mongol dogs fall under such restrictions today? The answer is complex. Modern militaries use tracking dogs extensively, but generally for finding enemy combatants, not for hunting civilians in hiding. The distinction matters morally, even if the tactical principle is similar. What the Mongol dogs at Kiev demonstrated, and what makes this historical episode so disturbing, is the vulnerability of the innocent in warfare. Those 317 people in the chamber beneath the Church of the Tithes weren't soldiers. They were civilians, families, children, elderly people, trying to survive an invasion they had no role in causing. Their discovery and subsequent fate represents not just a military success, but a humanitarian catastrophe, one that violated fundamental human intuitions about sanctuary and safety. That such discoveries were enabled by dogs, by the perversion of animals' natural abilities for violent ends, adds an additional layer of horror. 800 years later, we still haven't fully resolved the ethical questions raised by Kiev's fall. When is hunting civilians legitimate? What technologies or capabilities cross the line from military necessity to cruelty? How do we protect the innocent when hiding is impossible? The Mongol dogs force us to confront these questions because they made survival strategies insufficient. They demonstrated that cleverness, preparation, and silence couldn't save you if the enemy possessed superior capabilities and was willing to use them without mercy. That's the lasting implication of December 1240. Not just that Kiev fell, but that a certain kind of innocence fell with it, the belief that the powerless could escape the powerful through cleverness and concealment. The dogs taught a darker lesson. There is no escape if the hunter is committed enough and the tools are effective enough. That lesson echoes through subsequent centuries of warfare, from the trenches of World War I to the aerial bombardments of World War II to drone warfare today. Technology eliminates hiding places. Superior capabilities make resistance futile. The innocent suffer alongside the guilty. The Mongol Mastiffs of 1240 were early visceral demonstrations of this principle. Their legacy isn't just in military history, but in the darker understanding they imparted about human vulnerability and the impossibility of sanctuary in total war. What do you think drove Subotai and the Mongol commanders to employ such methodical psychological tactics? Was this simply military efficiency, or was there something more calculated in the terror they created? Leave your theories in the comments below. And if you're interested in this period of history, let us know. There are dozens of forgotten stories from the Mongol invasions that deserve attention. Subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of medieval history. We uncover the stories that textbooks skip, the dark corners of human history that reveal uncomfortable truths about warfare, survival, and the lengths people will go to in pursuit of power. This was the Siege of Kiev and the Mongol Dogs of 1240. A story of hunters and hunted, of innovation and terror, of survival and trauma. See you in the next video.